Hello. My name is the one they never defended. The night my parents chose my brother's lies, they didn't yell. They didn't argue. They quietly opened the door and let the snow decide what happened to me, my wife, my child. I stood there thinking it was a mistake. That family wouldn't do this. I didn't know that moment had been planned long before I arrived. And they never knew what else I was carrying with me that night. Let me tell you how a family lie turned into exile, and why walking back inside was never an option. The snow had been coming down since late afternoon, the kind that doesn't announce itself with drama at first, just a steady curtain that slowly erases the road. By the time we turned onto my parents' street, visibility had thinned to a narrow tunnel of headlights and white. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and slowed down, more out of habit than fear. I'd driven these roads my whole life. This visit was supposed to clear the air. That was the phrase my mother used on the phone. Clear the air. It sounded reasonable, calm, adult. I wanted to believe it meant we'd finally talk instead of circling each other through half-truths and silence. My wife sat beside me, hands folded in her lap, watching the snow streak across the windshield. Our son was quiet in the back seat, unusually so, his boots resting against the seat in front of him. No music played. No one suggested turning the radio on. The quiet felt heavier than the storm. When we pulled into the driveway, the house lights were already on. Every one of them. That caught my attention. Usually, my parents waited until they heard the car. I glanced at my phone. No message. No drive safe. No we're here. 2 cars were already parked. My brother's, of course. And another I didn't recognize. I felt a small tightening in my chest. Nothing sharp yet. Just a sense that I'd arrived late to something that had already started. Inside, the warmth hit me first. The familiar smell of coffee and clean wood followed. Everyone was seated in the living room, arranged in a way that felt intentional. My brother sat forward, elbows on his knees, calm and comfortable, like he belonged exactly where he was. My parents were side by side on the couch. No one stood up when we came in. There was no small talk, no asking about the drive, no comments about the weather. My brother spoke first, his voice measured, almost gentle. "We need to talk about something serious." I nodded, waiting. He didn't look at me when he continued. He spoke to the room. "Mom and Dad are worried. There've been some things, financial things, patterns that don't look good." I felt my brow crease. "What are you talking about?" He finally turned to me, concern carefully placed on his face. "We noticed some irregularities. Money moving around. You've had access. Anyone would have questions." The way he said it made it sound responsible, sensible, like he was doing everyone a favor. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. "If there's a question, ask me. I haven't moved anything that wasn't discussed." My mother didn't look at me. She stared at her hands. My father sighed, slow and practiced. "We've already been through this," my father said. That was the moment I knew. Not when my brother accused me. Not even when my parents stayed silent. It was that sentence. "Already been through this." My mother finally spoke, her tone tired. "We talked earlier. We didn't want this to turn into an argument." On the coffee table, I noticed a thin folder. Closed. Neat. Waiting. I felt something settle in my stomach, heavy and cold. This conversation didn't start tonight. It started without me. I tried again carefully. "If there's paperwork, if there's a concern, I can explain it. There's context you're missing." My brother shook his head slightly, like he was disappointed in me. "You always say that." My son shifted behind me. I could feel my wife's hand brush my arm, a quiet signal to stay calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I stood there, listening to a version of myself being described that I didn't recognize. Someone careless. Someone dishonest. Someone who needed boundaries. I thought about all the times I'd been the easy one. The one who didn't push back. The one who absorbed tension so others wouldn't have to. I still believed, somehow, that if I stayed steady, this could be resolved. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, louder now. My father stood up and walked toward the door. "Let's take a moment," he said. Everyone needs space. I nodded, relieved in a strange way. Space meant pause. Pause meant reconsideration. I reached for my coat, already thinking about what I'd say when we came back in. How I'd lay everything out calmly. How the door would open again. I stepped outside thinking the cold would only last a minute. I didn't hear the click. That's what I keep telling myself. Maybe the wind swallowed it. Or maybe I just didn't want to hear it. But when I turned back toward the door, snow already melting on my collar, it wasn't cracked open anymore. It was shut. Fully. Quietly. Completely. The porch light above me buzzed faintly in the cold. I stood there, still facing the door, hand half raised like I was about to knock. But I didn't. Not yet. I waited. The wind picked up. Snowflakes hit my cheeks sideways. I tucked my hands into my coat pockets and stepped off the porch onto the driveway, hoping maybe it was just a moment of space. A cooling off period. I'd give them a minute or two. They'll call me back in, I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Behind me, the car was still idling. My wife sat there, silhouetted by the dashboard lights, not moving. Our son was in the back seat, his face pressed to the window, watching me. I pulled out my phone. No new messages. Nothing from my mom. No missed calls from Dad. No apology. No, come back in, let's talk. I kept checking, like the screen might change if I stared at it long enough. I looked back at the house. Curtains drawn. Lights warm. Too warm. Like they were hosting something I was no longer invited to. This couldn't be it. We were just talking. Weren't we? I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't stormed out. I just stepped outside. This had to be a misunderstanding. I stepped back to the porch and knocked. Light at first. Then a little louder. The door cracked open just slightly. My mother's face appeared, eyes already bracing. Mom, can we finish the conversation? She didn't open it wider. I think it's best we all take some space tonight, she said, carefully, like someone stepping over thin ice. Behind her, I heard my brother's voice. He needs time. He's too close to this. Then she added softly, she's getting emotional. It's not helping. I blinked. She? I said. Are you talking about my wife? Mom didn't answer. Her gaze didn't meet mine. I took a breath. You're blaming her? For what? Sitting quietly while you all talked about me like I wasn't in the room. Let's not make this worse, she said, and the door began to close again. Mom! I started, stepping forward. She's not helping you think clearly, she said through the narrowing crack. You've changed. We see that now. And then the door shut again. This time I did hear the click. I stood there, chest rising, breath fogging the air in short bursts. Inside, I could hear movement, muffled voices. But no one came back. No one opened the door again. I turned and walked down the driveway. The snow had piled higher against the tires. My coat was soaked across the shoulders. I opened the car door and sat down, still facing the house. What happened? My wife asked, her voice quiet but steady. I shook my head. They think you're the problem now. She looked down, lips pressed tight. Our son leaned forward. Can we go home now? The word home hit me like ice water. I wasn't even sure where that was anymore. Then the porch light turned off. It was like the last word in a conversation we hadn't finished. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered before catching. I tried again. This time it started. The wipers dragged across the windshield, groaning under the weight of wet snow. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then my phone buzzed. A text. For a second, I felt a flicker of hope. It was from my brother. Don't come back until you've calmed down. That was it. I put the car in gear. Dad didn't even come to the door, my wife said, almost like she didn't mean for it to slip out. I didn't answer. As we pulled away, I realized none of them had followed us outside. The snow muffled everything but the sound of our tires crunching slowly over the frozen street. I kept my eyes on the road, though I could barely make out the lines anymore. Streetlights flickered through the haze, dull and distant. The heater blew weak warmth against the windshield, but my hands were still cold on the wheel. No one said a word. I took a left, then a right, not thinking about where we were going. I didn't have a destination, just the need to keep moving. If I stopped, I'd have to feel it all at once. And I wasn't ready. From the corner of my eye, I saw my wife watching me. Not in judgment, just watching. My son had dozed off. His head leaned against the car seat, lips parted slightly. His breath fogged the window. The windshield wipers squeaked and groaned, barely keeping up with the storm. I turned them up a notch, even though it didn't help much. The image kept replaying in my mind. The door closing. Not slammed, just shut, like sealing a box, or ending a meeting. They didn't yell. They didn't cry. They didn't say, "We'll talk later." They just closed it. And that somehow hurt more. A slammed door would have meant emotion. Anger. Regret, maybe. But the way it closed tonight, it was quiet. Intentional. Certain. That's when I realized they hadn't reacted. They had decided. Long before I even pulled into the driveway. Long before my son took off his boots at their front door. Maybe even before my mother said we should clear the air. They weren't trying to process anything. They were executing something. A verdict. I loosened my grip on the wheel. My knuckles had gone stiff. I pulled into a small grocery store parking lot. Empty, dark, except for the occasional flash of headlights from someone just as lost in the storm as I was. I kept the engine running. For a moment, I let my head rest back against the seat. Not to sleep, just to stop. And that's when the old memories started to bleed through. Being 8. Standing at the kitchen doorway while my brother threw a tantrum about getting the wrong cereal. My mom rushed to calm him, while my dad quietly motioned for me to go play. I hadn't said anything. I never did. Or 16, when I didn't get picked up from baseball practice because we got busy. No one even apologized. I walked home in the rain. My brother later said, "You never make a fuss, so they forget you're there." I thought about all the times I was told, "You're so easy," like it was a compliment, as if my silence made their lives more peaceful. But maybe it just made me easier to ignore. Tonight wasn't a break in the pattern. It was the result of it. And I'd been training myself for this moment for years without realizing it. In the driver's seat, I wiped my face with my sleeve. Not crying, just clearing away the fog of thought. Then I heard a soft voice behind me. "Dad?" My son mumbled, eyes barely open. "Are we still going to Grandma's for Christmas?" I swallowed hard before answering. "Not this year, buddy." He blinked a few times. "Are they mad at you?" My wife turned her head, looking out the window, silent. I kept my eyes forward. "No, they just need space." It was the gentlest lie I could offer. He yawned, leaned back, and drifted off again. No more questions. My wife placed a hand on my arm, not squeezing, just resting there, steady, present. And that's when it hit me. I couldn't afford to break. Not tonight. Not with him in the back seat and her beside me. Whatever pain I was in, whatever betrayal had just been carved into my chest, it would have to wait. If I cracked, we'd all fall through. That simple hand on my arm anchored me more than any word could have. The car idled in silence for a few more minutes. The snow still fell, hard and fast, but it felt quieter inside. I took a breath, then another, and a question surfaced, one I couldn't push down anymore. If I didn't draw a line now, if I let this pass like all the times before, when would it stop? What would my son grow up learning was acceptable? What would I be teaching him about worth? About dignity? This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about finally seeing the shape of the thing I'd been living under all my life and deciding I wouldn't hand it down to the next generation. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing with a clarity I hadn't had in years. We weren't going back. I kept the car pointed north, though I wasn't sure why. We had no hotel booked, no friend waiting. Just distance. That felt like enough for now. The snow had thickened again. The highway ahead looked less like pavement and more like a fading memory. I turned down the radio that had been playing low static, hoping to ease the weight pressing into my temples. My wife shifted quietly in her seat, wrapping her coat tighter. She hadn't spoken in a while, but I could feel her awake beside me. The kind of quiet that holds questions back. Our son was asleep in the back again, curled into the side of the door, one mitten still clutched in his hand. I'd forgotten to tell him to take his boots off, but he was too tired to care. At least the car was warm enough now. I glanced at the fuel gauge, still half a tank. I didn't like letting it dip below that in this kind of weather. I did a quick mental checklist. Gas, heat, visibility. The wipers were keeping up, barely. The headlights were useless in the whiteout. My fingers stayed tight around the wheel as I scanned for an exit. We needed a place to stop, even for just a few hours. Somewhere off the road, away from the wind. We passed one closed gas station, then a fast food joint with the lights still glowing but no cars in the lot. I kept driving. Part of me didn't want to stop. Stopping would mean deciding something. The dashboard lit up. My phone vibrated. I almost ignored it, but habit kicked in and I glanced down. The caller ID said unknown. Not spam. Not a name. Just vague enough to give me pause. I hesitated. Then I answered. Hello. The line crackled. A woman's voice came through, thin and struggling against the static. Mr. Langston? I tensed. Yes. Who's this? This is Amanda Klein. I'm with Miller and Hart Legal. We've been trying to reach you. My eyes narrowed. About what? I know this isn't the best timing, sir, but I was instructed to contact you directly. It's about your uncle, Richard Langston. He passed last week. You're named as the primary beneficiary. I blinked. I haven't spoken to him in over a decade. I understand, she said quickly. But he updated the documents last spring. You're listed by full legal name and address. There's a trust being activated. It includes property, accounts, and some conditions. Conditions? I repeated, unsure if I'd heard her right. Yes, I can't discuss all the details over the phone, but I was told to notify you immediately once your parents contacted us to dispute the document. I sat up straighter. They did what? This evening, roughly an hour ago. Our office was contacted by a Mr. Thomas Langston and Mrs. Elaine Langston. They claimed you were not in a position to manage what's been left. But legally, unless proven otherwise, you're the named recipient. The snow outside seemed to fall slower for a moment, even though I knew it hadn't. I'm driving through a storm with my family in the car, I said, steadying my voice. This isn't a good time. I completely understand. I just needed to make the call. I'll follow up tomorrow with documents. Please check your email when possible. She hung up before I could ask anything else. I put the phone back down and stared through the windshield, watching as another plow passed the other direction, pushing slush to the sides. The road behind us disappeared instantly. I didn't speak. Not right away. A few miles later, I pulled into a rest area, the kind with vending machines and a long row of empty spaces, all buried under snow. I left the engine running. My wife looked over. Everything okay? I nodded slowly. Just a call about Uncle Richard. She gave me a puzzled look. I thought he passed years ago. Apparently not. She didn't press, just leaned back, resting her head against the seat. I stared out at the snow. This changed things. Not in a good way. Not in a way I could trust. Whatever this was, it wasn't luck. It wasn't some rescue line tossed from the heavens. It was a complication. One I didn't ask for. One my family was already trying to strip from me. And suddenly, the earlier silence from the house made more sense. They'd already known. They hadn't just wanted me out. They wanted me out before the paperwork could reach me. This wasn't about disappointment. It was about control. I let out a slow breath. My hands were steady again. My heart not so much. I looked at my wife. And my son. This money, whatever it was, could help. A lot. But it would also pull us deeper into the storm. I knew it. I could feel the weight of it already. I didn't want it to ruin them the way it had already twisted the people we left behind. So, for now, I said nothing. I turned the wheel slowly and pulled back onto the road. The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it was worse. But the road felt more familiar now. Not safer, just clearer. This wasn't a blessing. It was a burden, and I would carry it for now in silence. I didn't tell my family what the call meant, but I knew the night wasn't done with us yet. By the time I parked the car behind a roadside motel on the edge of town, the snow had thinned to a lazy dusting, but the cold had settled deep. I sat there for a moment longer, letting the engine idle, watching the fog on the windows thicken. My wife was still awake but silent beside me. She hadn't asked about the phone call, and I hadn't offered anything. Inside, the motel room smelled faintly of bleach and old smoke. The heater groaned to life with a metallic rattle that reminded me of my father's old workshop in the basement, where I used to sit on a stool and hand him tools, hoping for a conversation that never came. I didn't remember falling asleep, but when I opened my eyes again, gray morning light was seeping in around the edges of the cheap curtains. My back ached. My head felt heavier than it should have. And everything was quiet, except for that heater still clanking like it was trying to breathe. My wife and son were still asleep. She was curled toward him protectively, one hand resting near his chest. His sock had slipped off in the night. I gently covered his foot with the edge of the blanket and stood up. There was nothing in that room that felt familiar. No framed photos, no coat hooks, not even a clock on the wall. I moved slowly, trying not to wake them, and picked up my phone from the nightstand. 9 missed calls. 3 from home, 1 from Dad's cell, and 5 from a number I didn't recognize but could guess. I scrolled through the messages. The first was from Mom. "Let's not let one night undo everything." Then, "You're still our son. We love you. Please don't make this bigger than it needs to be." And finally, "Call us back when you're ready to talk like family." There was no apology, no mention of the cold, of the child they'd turned out into a snowstorm, of the silence that had followed us out the door. But the tone, God, the tone. It was as if I'd raised my voice, caused the scene, forced their hand. And for a moment I considered calling. I really did. I imagined it. I'd say something vague, let them feel like they'd extended an olive branch. They'd invite us to come back, offer a warm breakfast, say they just want peace. We'd sit in the same chairs, under the same ceiling, pretending nothing had shifted. It would be easier. For everyone. For my wife. For my son. Even for me if I was being honest. I stared at the phone so long the screen went dark in my hand. That's when I noticed it. No message from my brother. Nothing. Not even a one-word check-in. The person who'd started this, who'd stood in front of my parents and painted me as unstable, unreliable, unworthy. He hadn't even bothered with a lie this time. And it clicked. They'd always told me I was the one who didn't hold grudges. That I was calm, easygoing. That I knew how to keep the peace. But the truth was, I'd been trained to swallow my side of things because no one else wanted to hold theirs. Forgiveness had always been a one-way street. I sat back down on the edge of the bed and stared at the carpet, watching dust shift in the thin morning light. My wife stirred. "You okay?" I looked up. "I will be." She didn't press, just nodded and leaned back on the pillow. That silence, her quiet trust, meant more than any word I could have read in those messages. I stood again and paced slowly to the window. Outside, the parking lot was frozen over. A few other cars sat there, some with frost still on the windshields. Life was going on, for everyone but us. I knew if I said the word, she'd pack up and drive with me straight back to that house. We'd ring the bell. We'd pretend. We'd go along with the family script and be welcomed back as long as I never mentioned the truth again. But I couldn't. Not this time. Not after last night. And not after the call I hadn't told her about yet. She deserved to know, of course. So did my son one day. But not now. Right now, what we needed was space to breathe before the next thing hit. Because there would be a next thing. I could feel it coming, like thunder you haven't heard yet but already believe in. I slipped my phone back into my coat pocket and sat beside her. She placed her hand over mine. No questions. No pressure. Just presence. And that was enough to remind me who I was doing this for. I didn't need to win. I didn't need to make them pay. But I needed to stop giving away pieces of myself just to stay inside a room they'd always controlled. I'd almost let it go. I'd almost traded the truth for belonging. But sitting there, in that cheap motel, with my family safe and the world outside still frozen, I realized something sharper than any cold front I'd driven through. I realized then that staying quiet had never protected me. It had only protected them. I didn't say anything when we checked out of the motel. My wife kept the boy wrapped in his coat, carrying him half asleep to the car. The snow had started again, light this time, more like dust than threat, but the sky was still heavy, and so was everything else. I sat behind the wheel for a few seconds, engine idling, hands still on the key. I wasn't sure where we were going. I knew where we couldn't go, but that didn't help much. I pulled out onto the main road, just to keep moving. Motion felt safer than stillness. We stopped at a gas station about 10 minutes outside the city. While they used the restroom and grabbed some snacks, I filled the tank, then leaned against the hood with my phone. That's when the first text came in. It was from an old colleague, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year, and certainly not about family matters. Hey, just checking in. Heard something odd and thought you should know. Folks from your side mentioned you'd been going through a rough patch. If you ever need someone neutral to talk to, I'm around. I stared at the screen, rereading it. Neutral. Rough patch. Those were the kind of words people used when they were trying to help, or when they were trying not to get sued. I replied simply, thanks. All good for now. I put the phone in my pocket. But the shift in my chest was instant. I knew that tone. I'd heard it in corporate HR calls and school parent meetings. The soft edge that disguised a hook. Inside the store, my wife was helping our son pick out a juice box. She looked up and gave me a quick, tired smile. I returned it, but my mind had already moved on. Back in the car, we pulled out into traffic. I turned the heater up. The snow danced across the windshield. Not enough to worry the wipers, just enough to blur the lines. The phone rang next. Unknown number. Area code local. I answered. Hello, Mr. Dunn? A woman's voice. Smooth. Careful. Yes. My name is Allison. I'm calling on behalf of Dr. Meyer's office. Just a quick courtesy check-in. Dr. Meyer? I hadn't seen him since my annual checkup last spring. I'm sorry, what's this about? Oh, nothing urgent. We just had a message from a concerned family member. They mentioned some possible emotional stress and asked if you might benefit from scheduling a conversation with one of our in-network counselors. I said nothing. She filled the pause. Again, purely optional. We just like to be proactive in these situations. Who gave you my name? I'm afraid I can't share that. Of course. I thanked her and hung up, then sat in silence while the wheels kept turning and the heater whirred. This wasn't random. This was preemptive. This was someone laying the groundwork. Concern was such a polite weapon. I could already feel the narrative forming. It was subtle, nearly invisible to the untrained eye. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Unstable. Fragile. Possibly a risk to his child's well-being. Not explicitly accused, just whispered about. Just enough to plant doubt. Just enough to get ahead of the facts. I pulled over into a quiet parking lot near a closed garden center and sat there, thinking. I didn't explode. That would have helped them. Instead, I thought about the timing. How quickly that concern had materialized. How casually it was already being passed around like a shared truth. And I knew. This wasn't my parents. Not directly. This had my brother's fingerprints all over it. He knew how to frame a story. He knew how to speak just short of defamation, while pointing everyone in the direction he wanted. And my parents? They wouldn't argue it. They'd nod gently. They'd say things like, "We're just worried about him," and then step back while the damage unfolded. I wasn't mad. Not the way I used to be. Anger required energy I didn't have. What I felt now was something sharper, cleaner, focus. I opened my email and started creating a folder. Titled it, Family Legal. I pulled up the messages from the past week and began saving screenshots. Every vague text. Every non-apology. Every subtle dig that could later serve as context. Then I added the doctor's office number and timestamp. I still had a file of old emails years ago when I'd offered to mediate between my brother and our father after their first falling out. I remembered their tone back then. How quickly the roles had reversed when I didn't take a side. I'd saved those too. Out of habit. Now that habit felt less paranoid and more like foresight. Across from me, my wife sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't asleep, just waiting. "What's going on?" she asked softly. I paused. "They're starting something." She nodded, not in surprise but in recognition. "Is it him?" "It always is." She didn't ask which him I meant. We didn't speak for a while. Then I opened the console and pulled out a small notebook I kept in the car. Flipping to a blank page, I started writing down a timeline. Who called when? What was said? Where we were? Then I wrote one line underlined in black ink. Silence isn't neutral. Because that was the truth. All those years I'd stayed quiet, thinking it was keeping the peace. It wasn't. It was giving permission. Now I was done giving. Before we drove off again, I made one more call. Not to accuse, not to scream, just to ask questions. Quiet ones, documented ones. The kind that made people aware that I wasn't asleep anymore. They thought I wouldn't fight back, but I wasn't fighting the way they expected. They thought I wouldn't fight back, but I wasn't fighting the way they expected. A few days passed. We were staying in a small, furnished rental on the edge of town. Temporary housing that didn't feel like home but gave us enough space to breathe. Snow had started to melt, leaving behind slushy sidewalks and muddy parking lots. The mood outside was thawing. Inside me, things were crystallizing. Calls didn't stop. If anything, they picked up. Some were from people I hadn't heard from in years. High school friends, distant cousins. All with that same careful tone. "Hey, just wanted to check in. Heard things got a little tense. I know family stuff can spiral fast, but you've always been the grounded one." The words were dipped in sugar, but they didn't land sweet. I could tell which tree they'd fallen from. They weren't checking in. They were checking up. I kept my answers short, calm, collected, never gave more than necessary. But I started a new document on my laptop. Incidents, external outreach. Date, time, name, message summary. I wasn't keeping score. I was building context. My wife noticed. She didn't ask questions. But one evening, while folding laundry on the motel bed, she said, "They're trying to draw you out." I looked at her. "I know. You're not giving them what they want." "No," I paused. "But they're getting reckless." That night I received an email, forwarded by a mutual acquaintance. The subject line was simple, "Is this true?" Attached was a screenshot. It was supposedly a statement. Looked like a legal memo, summarizing events at the house that night. It implied that I had left in a distressed state, that my emotional stability may have posed risk to others, and that a pattern of behavior had raised concerns within the family. It was signed, with my name. I never wrote it, never said those words, never agreed to anything close. First I froze, not with fear, just with the ice of betrayal. It was bold, sloppy, and stupid. I went back to my files, looked at the timeline, checked my messages from that day. The document couldn't hold up against my actual whereabouts and interactions. But it didn't need to be true. It only needed to exist in someone's inbox. That's when I knew this wasn't family friction anymore. It was fabrication. Crossed a line. The next morning, I pulled up old emails from years ago, when my brother had nearly cost a business partner their job by accidentally letting a private text chain circulate. That time, too, he'd played innocent, claimed no bad intent. My parents had backed him. He was just trying to help, they'd said. Same tactics, different stage. And now the stakes were mine. By mid-afternoon, I was sitting in the car outside the rental, laptop open, phone recording my notes. That's when another message came in. From him. It was short. Too short. "Let's not make this worse than it is. Maybe you should talk to someone." Attached, a copy of the same fake document. Forwarded again. But he made a mistake. Below his message in the email chain was a string of earlier drafts, versions he hadn't cleaned up. One had metadata showing edits from his personal Gmail. Another had a note. "Make it sound like he's just overreacting. Not dangerous. He'd left the breadcrumbs. He'd overplayed his hand. I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't respond. Didn't need to. I saved everything. Backed it up twice. Printed it once. Then I called my legal contact. We went over it calmly. I shared the documents. I let them walk through it all, point by point. When they were done, they exhaled slowly and said, "This isn't just messy. It's actionable." I didn't smile, but something inside me settled. I wasn't the paranoid one. I wasn't being dramatic. I was the target of something calculated. And now I had proof. I didn't announce anything. I didn't warn them. That's not how you win this kind of game. You wait. You let them think they're still running the board. Then you move. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing when this would end. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing when this would end. It had taken almost 2 weeks. Enough time for the dust to settle. For emotions to cool on the surface, though underneath nothing had truly softened. That afternoon, I drove to the old house. The driveway looked just as it had 100 Sundays before. Gray, wet, lined with half-melted snowbanks. The porch light was already on, even though it wasn't dark yet. Someone was expecting a scene. I stepped inside the formal living room we rarely used except for holidays or arguments. My parents were seated side by side on the floral couch. My brother stood near the fireplace, one hand in his pocket like he had somewhere better to be. No one rose to greet me. They thought this was theirs to control. I nodded. "Thanks for agreeing to meet." My voice was calm, almost casual. I took a seat in the high-back chair across from them, deliberately not the one offered at the head of the room. I didn't need elevation to hold my ground. My father cleared his throat. "We've been worried, you know." The silence, it hasn't helped. My brother smirked faintly. "A lot of people are concerned, man. You've kind of vanished." I said nothing, just crossed one leg over the other and waited. My mother chimed in, too rehearsed. "We thought it would be good to clarify things, clear the air, maybe apologize on both sides." There it was. The trap laid in pleasantries. The implication that blame was balanced. That this was a misunderstanding. I let the silence stretch a little longer. Long enough for them to squirm. Then my brother jumped. Loud, sharp, classic. "You're blowing this whole thing up. Acting like we plotted some conspiracy. You walked out, remember? And now what? You're collecting receipts like a prosecutor." He laughed. A little too loud. "That's not family, man. That's sick." My father shifted, uncomfortable but not interrupting. My mother looked down. Convenient. I let him finish. Then I spoke. "Are you done?" He opened his mouth but didn't answer. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Clean, unmarked. Opened it slowly, like I had all day. Inside, copy of the false statement. Metadata printout. Email threads. Unedited. Texts. I slid the folder onto the coffee table. "You don't have to say anything," I said. "I'm not here for an apology." My brother frowned, glanced at the pages. Didn't touch them. "Look familiar?" He stayed still. I leaned back in the chair. "This isn't about feelings anymore. It's about facts." They didn't speak. Even the air conditioner kicked off, leaving the room quiet enough to hear the refrigerator hum from the kitchen. I let the quiet sink in. Then I added, "The firm I've spoken to has verified the documents. I've been advised not to pursue criminal charges yet, but that may change, depending on what happens next." My brother stepped forward. "You're threatening your own family?" I met his eyes. "I'm documenting the damage. There's a difference." He scoffed, but I could see the flush rise under his collar. His hands curled at his sides. Tells he still hadn't learned to hide. My mother finally whispered, "Why would you do this?" And I said calmly, "I didn't create any of this. I just stopped pretending it wasn't happening." My brother laughed again, but it cracked midway. "Whatever. This is about the inheritance, isn't it? That's all it's ever been." That's when I said it. "There is an inheritance." They froze. I continued, "It was conditional. It activated after your documented interference in a legal matter involving me, which now exists on record. My father stood. That can't be right. That's not. It's already done. I didn't have to elaborate. I saw the math happening behind his eyes. My brother's voice rose. This is ridiculous. He's manipulating everything. Mom, Dad, he's not stable. He was talking faster now, his voice cracking. And then he said it. Exactly what I needed him to say. You think I'd let him control what happens to this family? After what he pulled. He looked at our parents, desperate. You saw the emails. You agreed. We had to protect ourselves. There it was. His admission. Right in front of them. Their silence was no longer passive. It was participation. I stayed seated. I'm not here to take anything from you, I said quietly. But I'm not giving you space to keep rewriting what happened. Nobody spoke. I stood slowly, gathering the folder. I've outlined the boundaries I'll be keeping moving forward. My attorney will be in touch. My father tried to say something, but it caught in his throat. My mother's eyes were wet. I nodded once, more out of habit than respect, and turned toward the door. They were still talking when I stood up, and that told me everything. They were still talking when I stood up, and that told me everything. I didn't look back as I left. Just walked to my car, started the engine, and drove away. No part of me wanted to hear the justifications, the rewrites, the subtle pivots that had defined so much of my family's language. Let them keep talking. Let them fill the room with noise. Several weeks passed. I moved into the new place. A small, two-bedroom home at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. No grand entrance, no gates or statement pieces. Just a clean space, solid floors, and the kind of silence that didn't feel like waiting. That evening, I sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by unopened boxes and the smell of takeout. The heater ticked faintly in the background. My daughter had fallen asleep early, curled up in her room with a stuffed bear she'd had since preschool. My wife was reading in the other room, her voice occasionally drifting out as she read lines aloud to herself. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. The legal mess was settled. Not loudly, but thoroughly. My boundaries had been delivered in writing backed by law. But I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to toast. Only the understanding that the storm had passed, and we were still standing. Some evenings, like this one, I caught myself expecting more. Closure, maybe. A call. A message. Something that resembled remorse. But none came. The updates trickled in through cousins, mutual acquaintances, people who didn't mean to gossip but always did. My brother wasn't speaking to anyone outside his immediate circle. My parents had stepped back from things. Someone said they were still hoping it'll all blow over. They hadn't reached out. Not really. A vague holiday card. A forwarded recipe email that was probably sent by accident. But never a conversation. Never an acknowledgement. And I realized that was their peace. Pretending nothing happened. Mine came from accepting that something had. I didn't need apologies to move forward. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me free. I reached into a box beside me, one I hadn't touched since the move, and pulled out the scarf. Same one I wore during that cold confrontation in the living room. Back then, it had felt like a shield. A way to wrap myself in something to feel less exposed. Now, I held it in my hands and smiled. It didn't feel like armor anymore. Just a part of me I brought through the fire. I draped it over the back of the couch, not needing to wear it. I hadn't reinvented myself. I just stopped collapsing into spaces that never saw me. I leaned back, listening to the house settle. The ticking of the heater, the hum of the fridge, the simple, dependable sounds of a life rebuilt on my terms. The money had come through, quietly. No big lump sum, no showy deposits, just access to resources I never had before. We used it practically, paid off debt, set aside for our daughter's education, took time off work to breathe, to think, to plan. But it didn't change everything. Security wasn't the same as happiness. And no amount of cash could rewrite the years I spent bending myself to keep a peace that never included me. What did change things, what made the real difference, was the line I'd drawn. The one I didn't cross again. I no longer picked up the phone out of guilt. No longer showed up to gatherings I wasn't welcome at in my full truth. I no longer sat at tables that demanded my silence as the cost of belonging. Family, I learned, wasn't defined by who shared your name. It was who honored your voice when you spoke. And love, real love, never required you to disappear. I stood up from the floor, stretched, and walked to the front window. Outside, the sky was fading into a soft blue-gray. The street lamps flickered on. A neighbor walked their dog past, waved. I waved back. This life wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. But it was mine. I didn't leave with their approval, but I left with myself.